I'm sorry, I can't help but think of, I don't know if any of you are familiar with her. I'm blanking on her name because obviously I don't find her name to be worth remembering, but she was like one of these very famous social media Mormon moms, and she ended up like really abusing her kids. I think her friend might have been named Jody.
Yeah.
She was the one who was like instigating the crazy. But in Ruby Frankie's journals, when she was justifying the physical abuse of her children, and
Mhm.
she's been since recorded, I think, saying this verbally as well. The analogy she uses is like, well, if your children are on fire, you kick them and you beat them until the fire goes out, right? Like it's a way of showing them love. So that sounds a lot to me like that. Like
Yeah.
and so again, I just if you agree with me that those are somewhat analogous, is then that also a show of love if you really are helping some like again, I maybe some people have Black Snake Moan with Christina Ricci, where Morgan Freeman's character chains her up as she gets over her drug withdrawals. Like there's so many examples we can look at, right, in real world or in fiction of someone doing physical harm to someone else, doing something we would probably all say is wrong,
Yeah.
right? If not potentially evil. And yet, this sort of justification could potentially work. And this is an ends justify the means sort of thing, which is actually a form of consequentialist ethics, right? So something is good or right as long as it maximizes the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people, right? So I will
Yeah.
leave that to you all. Yes. So I'm going to throw a potential feminist curveball at you there,
Mhm.
right? Which is that that can unfortunately lend itself to a little bit of essentialism, right? In which case people are only valued in the grand design or purpose should they be fulfilling a biological function, which unfortunately puts a bit more of an onus on the female biology
Mhm.
than the males.
Mhm.
So that again, if we are going to be consequentialist about these things, we also want to consider the consequences of any sort of doctrine, right, that we're going to be promoting if we think that following these beliefs and these actions are going to lead us to be good or to be worthy of a divine reward in the end. That's good. Interesting, interesting. Anyone else have their dialogues yet? Anything to share? Hey, right? Yes, you're being the stingray. That's what they used to call Socrates in the market. They called him a stingray because he would just zap people until they like okay, I don't know. I got to think about this some more, right? Yeah, that's exactly the best case scenario. Even if you can't get them to agree with you, is to at least get them to start asking themselves questions, right? Awesome, awesome. Well done. And you guys left things on good terms too, hopefully.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, and that can also, in and of itself, sometimes lead the conversation in that way indirectly, right? Because as you've noticed, a lot of philosophy is just defining words, but sometimes the thought it takes to define a concept brings up those questions, right? Makes you sort of raise those questions, sometimes for the first time if you don't have a solid definition, right, of what it means. And listening is great. That's actually the basis of the Socratic method, right? So one of the foundations of what is called philosophical dialectic, right, is are the kinds of conversations you guys are doing in this assignment, right? It's just a conversation with people who disagree and are sharing their reasons behind that, right? Or explaining even. And I hope, again, even if you don't find any agreement with the people you have these conversations with, and even if you don't wind up using any of this in your actual final draft, this assignment is my absolute favorite for you all. It's not only the most fun to read because they often end up being very rich conversations, but I think it's the most important skill set for you to develop in the world right now. Like you are inevitably going to be interacting with people in the world who you disagree with on controversial topics, right? Not low stakes things, high stakes things. And we need to be able to have those conversations with people, be honest and authentic to our views, but not break relationships as a result of that, right? And unfortunately, society doesn't give us a lot of great examples of how to do that, right? They give us a lot of examples of how to argue and fight and yell and scream over each other. I mean, that's basically the news, right? It's like, I think it was a joke one point of like how many boxes of people they could get up there talking over each other at one point, right? It's absurd. That is not a conversation, right? No one is hearing anybody talk. Everyone is just waiting for their turn to talk. And so really being able to have deep conversations with someone who disagrees with you and knowing that ahead of time and still being willing to go into those conversations, right? If anything about William James struck you, I think the ethics of belief here is it, right? That the way that we do philosophy and we bring that into our lives is having those interactions with people. And it's not always comfortable. In fact, it's usually not. I've definitely gone through the growing pains in my own family of like people always saying like, why do you always have to bring this up and bring, I'm like, I'm not bringing it up. They bring it up because they know I'm willing to engage with them, right? And why are you telling me to stop talking about it? Tell them to stop talking about it, right? Like the onus is always on the person who's more reasonable, which means probably you, if you're engaging in the conversation from a philosophical perspective, right? Really trying to be intellectually humble, right? Being open to asking questions, even of things we already think we know, right? So a great response to someone who says something that you disagree, like just be honest, like, wow, can you share with me? Like, why? Right? Like, again, asking questions is a sign of interest. It's a sign of respect. It's not disrespectful necessarily to question people about their beliefs. Of course, you could go about it disrespectfully, right? But by listening and saying like, huh, that's really interesting. I would love to know more about that, right? Like that gives them a chance in a non-defensive sort of way, right? To just share with you where they're at. So yeah, I hope you develop some skills. I hope it gets past the discomfort. I'm so glad some of you have already had your discussions and they seem to have gone well. I look forward to reading everyone's reports. All right. Any questions about the paper? Again, we're coming up towards the end of the quarter, which means that we are now in the editing phases of our drafts. So that means either finally getting around to making those changes based on feedback that you've gotten from me, again, because I've been behind on grading. So I haven't necessarily been docking you for not making changes based on previous feedback, but those points will be docked on the final draft, right? So again, that's 100 points. So any feedback, especially feedback from me, right? Again, from our peers, we're all still learning. So you can take those things with a grain of salt. But if I tell you over and over again, you need to do something and it's not done in the final draft, right? You can expect docking of points, right? And it unfortunately is not going to be a surprise, right? Because I will have commented on it many times. So don't expect feedback on the final draft, right? It should be just a result of how well you've incorporated the feedback thus far. Yeah, so again, any questions about the final draft, finishing up the class, the quarter? No? All right. Lovely. All right, so we are continuing our conversation this week on religious pluralism. So Tuesday, we covered Panikar's paper, which just gives us a sort of overview of the different attitudes one could take. And again, attitude, he means in an epistemic sort of way, like how we can form beliefs about our own religious beliefs and other people's, right? Especially when they contradict each other or don't necessarily align in a clear way. So let's do a quick review, and I'm going to call on people to help us review the different attitudes one could take. So let's start off with exclusivism. Right? Who wants to remind us what religious exclusivism is? We get some volunteers before I have to call on people. Excellent. Right. So the exclusivity part, right, of this term is doing a lot of heavy lifting in terms of its meaning, right? Only one religion is all true, right? Typically, it's the one that the exclusivist adheres to, right? So most exclusivists themselves maintain adherence to a particular set of religious doctrines. And so the belief that one is true typically refers to theirs, right? It would be a little unreasonable to be an exclusivist, but be like, oh, but my religion isn't the correct one. It's someone else's, I guess, unless you're a cult leader and you're being real honest, right? Like, yeah, no, not this one, but some other one is definitely correct. Right? That's not usually how it works. So again, religious exclusivism, typically refers to the personal belief of the exclusivist, right? That's going to be the one true religion in their eyes, right? And so we started on Tuesday as well, and we're going to finish up today talking about Alvin Plantinga's argument for religious exclusivism, right? So he's going to be defending that particular view. But again, he's a philosopher, so he's not being lazy or irresponsible about it, right? He's going to be very, very specific about what type of religious exclusivism he's going to say is rational or justified. Okay. Then inclusivism is the next one that Panikkar talks about. Who can remind us what religious inclusivism is? Excellent. That's exactly right. Okay, so it's still maintaining that only one religion is completely true. Again, usually the one that they adhere to. Again, it would be silly to think that yours wasn't the one true one, right? But it's at least showing enough respect to the other religious traditions that exist in the world to say that they too are providing some, even if incomplete, part of that picture, right? Or are getting you at least some way towards the ultimate goal, whatever that goal is, right? Enlightenment, eternal paradise, right? Whatever it is. Some paths might lead you closer to the goal than others, right? But that only one is completely true. Excellent, excellent. Okay, the next two are a little bit trickier. Okay, they go by different names. So the first one is called religious pluralism. The second one is radical pluralism. Okay, so we're going to start off with religious pluralism, otherwise known as parallelism. You can remind us what this one is. Very good, right? So this, in some ways, one might say is the most charitable, even though it's not at the bottom of the list, right? Because it grants full truth, full, again, I'm going to use this word again because it's so fun, salvific veracity, right? To every individual religion, right? So each one is complete on its own, right? Getting at that picture of truth or at capturing that goal. Okay, and so the last one is radical pluralism or interpenetration. And again, that interpenetration word here is probably going to give you a little bit of a better indication as to what the meaning of this one is. You can remind us what radical pluralism is. Exactly right. Okay, so in this case, it's not necessarily as charitable as the previous one, right? Because like you said, it's not saying that any one religion is complete on its own. Okay, so it's in some cases the least charitable of all of them, right? Because the first two say that at least one is complete. The third one says all of them are complete. This one is saying none of them are complete. But you're absolutely right. By learning about as many of the world religions as we can, right? The more we learn, the closer we can get to that complete picture, right? Of truth. The closer we can reach whatever the goal or the path leads to, right? So you have to learn as much as you can. So what's interesting about Alvin Plantinga's argument for religious exclusivism, though, is that it does include an element of interpenetration, right? In order to be a religious exclusivism or religious exclusivist and still be rational, he says you have to learn about other religions, right? So even as a religious exclusivist, right, you still might have an epistemic obligation, right? If you want to be considered rational or justified, you might still have to, you have this obligation to learn, right? You could still be just accidentally true as an exclusivist, right? But it wouldn't be rational or justified or let alone warranted if you didn't do the due diligence of bothering to learn about the competing religious traditions, right? Like maybe you just happen to be born into a culture that practices the right one, right? Like, no, he's not going to give you any epistemic credit for that, right? So if you are going to be justified as a religious exclusivist, right? That's again, in some ways also a less charitable one, right? Because it's considering most religions to be false, right? Only one true is true. You still have an obligation to learn about the other ones, right? So you need to know why their explanations are less satisfactory, right? Or less valid or less cogent, right? Than the others. Okay, good. So yeah, sort of like what you were doing, David, with in your interview, right? If you're going to defend this conception of God, you need to know about these other conceptions of God, right? And you need to be able to say why those are incorrect, right? To justify yours as being preferable, right? So they all go hand in hand. It's exactly what he's saying. All right, good. And then the fifth secret attitude or one could take towards religious diversity that Panakar mentions, and we always want to be responsible and acknowledge, is skepticism, right? Of course, you could just be skeptical and think that none of the religions capture truth or get us to any sort of goal that the religion claims to get. So if it's enlightenment, they don't actually get you there, right? If it's an eternal reward, it doesn't actually take you there, or that's not an accurate depiction of what happens after you die or something like this. All right, so for that overview, again, there's a quick reference on this gig philosophy page. Oh, you might have to remove the question mark at the end of that URL. But yeah, that one, the religious diversity one should get you there. And then if you want to see some of the specifics again for the Abrahamic religion specifically, they're just to the left of that. All right, so then we talked about Linda Zagzebski, right, who was maybe questioning the question, right? We always have to have those philosophers, like what exactly, again, are we trying to do here with the philosophical question of religious diversity? Well, again, we're probably trying to alleviate the ills and harms of the world that come from religious disputes, right? And so is it even the right thing to do to be asking which one is the one true one, right? Do we need to be creating those beliefs in us, especially if something like what Plantinga said is correct, right? Which is that he is going to defend, as part of his view of religious exclusivism, a sort of arrogance or egotism, right? And I think this is where we left off on Tuesday. So it's a great way to pick back up, right? Which is the idea that if you think that you are correct, right, that your belief is true, and thus someone who has a different belief from you, they must be incorrect, right? Their belief must be false. Does that automatically imply arrogance or egotism? So I asked you guys to think about this at the end of class on Tuesday. And I have seen people have already bailed because maybe they weren't here on Tuesday. They need to go watch the recording. That's all right. But what do we think about this? Where did we end up? Could we think of a counterexample? Could anyone think of an instance where you could think that you are right, someone else is wrong, and it not result in you being arrogant about that thing? Good. So this is a difference between, and this is often a common mistake, is that we often accuse all confidence of being arrogance, but you're right, they're different, right? Like you can be confident in something without being arrogant, right? And so the difference here, and I'm giving you here a definition of epistemic arrogance, right? So a philosophical definition here, is a bias you have towards your own knowledge or understanding, right? So if you think that your belief is true and that someone else's belief is false, that becomes a form of epistemic arrogance when you overestimate your own knowledge or understanding on that topic, and thus leading to a lack of humility in the way you treat the beliefs you think are false. Okay, so it's only going to be arrogant if you dismiss them, ignore them, right? Every time they contradict you, right? So this is a place where, again, you might have to approach something philosophically to not be arrogant in this. That's the only way I can think of doing it, right? The only way to say, like, I'm right and you're wrong and not do this is to engage in something like this, the dialogue, the dialectic we were talking about, right? Being willing to hear opposing views, right? Because if you're not dismissing them and if you're not ignoring them, right, then you're not at least acting on a bias, right? Now, if the problem is that you hear them and then you still just dismiss them or don't take them seriously, that could still be an element of arrogance, right? But the idea is that because you think you're right, you then so overestimate your abilities, it allows you to dismiss or ignore anything that goes against it, right? And again, I've certainly spent enough time, at least to me, enough time thinking about certain topics, right? Where like, I feel like I did my due diligence, right? Like I've arrived at a viewpoint. So when I do come across views that go against it, I do sometimes dismiss them, right? And so that may or may not depend on like if new information comes out, right? So like maybe I'm not arrogant in doing that until I ignore information that would actually change my view, right? So then I'm no longer doing my due diligence. So there it does sort of maybe the critique or the way that a philosopher might respond to this is by saying, all right, Plantinga, you're right. The only way to avoid epistemic arrogance is by remaining agnostic, right, about something, by being willing to withhold belief. Or a more charitable version of this is something we get from feminist epistemology, where, and sometimes we also see this in anti-realist conversations, but you look at the function that something serves, and you're always going to be willing to revise your belief based on new information, right? So if you said, okay, well, I could potentially think that I'm right and you're wrong, but still I have to be willing to say that my rightness could be overturned in the future, right? So as long as you're willing to do that, I think you would also avoid being epistemically arrogant in this way, right? So as long as it serves that function, but I need, if it no longer does that, I need to be willing to revise my belief based on new information. Right, so like I'll give you an example of this. In animal ethics, there's a debate about sentience, right? The ability to feel pain and pleasure. And this is important for utilitarians or consequentialist ethicists who judge rightness or wrongness based on maximizing pleasure or minimizing pain, right? And so there is a question, right? A lot of philosophers spent a lot of time, including, very, very famous philosophers. The famous one I'm thinking of, his name is Peter Singer. He still does a lot of public philosophy if you're interested in him. But he very famously argued for animal rights based on sentience, but he famously said, like, I'm going to cut off moral standing at, I think he said crustaceans or something. Like, he doesn't think anything below the food chain of crustaceans has sentience. Now, modern science has shown us that there are many creatures on the food chain below crustaceans that have far more complex central nervous systems than we first knew and realized. And in fact, even insects can experience emotions, right? Like, that ruins his argument, right? If he had not bothered to update that belief, if he continues to maintain that sentience only applies to crustaceans, given that we now have this new information, right, that would be epistemically irresponsible, right? But at the time, he was just being very pragmatic, like, okay, where can we draw the line? Well, given what we know, I'm going to say here to be safe, right? But that's not arrogant as long as you're willing to revise it, right, based on new information. Okay, so you can say that those are the two, I think, best alternatives we have to this. If you disagree with Plantinga here, right, that being right means you're automatically arrogant. The two alternatives are to be agnostic, right, to say even if you're sort of confident in your belief, you just don't commit, right, one way or the other, or to commit but with an asterisk, right? Willing to revise upon new information. Okay, good. So that leads us to, gotta open PowerPoint, to, I believe, the epistemic objections, right? So those were the moral objections to Plantinga that we were finishing reviewing there, right? So the first one was that it was oppressive or imperialistic, right? And there's where we talked about the difference between belief and action, right? And even he acknowledges that beliefs can contribute, of course, to actions. And surely exclusivism is part of problematic activity, right? But again, that's probably not the kind of exclusivism he is going to be defending in the end, right, as justifiable. Okay, so then we move on to the epistemic objections. Okay, and this is, again, I don't want you to get too hung up on this. This is slides 24 through 26, right? This is where it gets super technical. And again, I just want you to remember, this is Plantinga saying, look, no matter how you define justification, I can show you that being a religious exclusivist can be justified under each of these ways, right? So these are just many different ways of just defining justification, right? Different theories of epistemic justification. He's a proper functionalist. Okay, so his view is the last one at the end on page 26 with the asterisk next to it. Okay, that's his view. But so even though all the other ones aren't his conception of justification, he's saying again, he's just being a good philosopher. Even under your view, it's justified. Justification for you, justification for you. Everyone's justified, right? In all these accounts. Okay, so we're just going to go through these really quick, right? A deontological view of justification is very much like deontological ethics, meaning that it's just rule-based, okay? And it tends to get the rules based on correlation with reason, which produces duties, right? So in the case of ethics, they would be moral duties. In the case of beliefs, they would be epistemic duties, right? So if you're a deontologist about justification, you think we have certain obligations, right, to be rational or justified when forming beliefs. And so the only way you're going to be irrational is if you're flouting those duties, right? And they can be how exactly that works out is going to, differ depending on different things, right? But it typically just has to do with what our intellect and cognitive abilities are able to do. Okay, so justification is being within your own intellectual or cognitive rights, that is violating no cognitive duties in the forming or sustaining of your belief, right? So if one of the duties you think we have is to proportion our belief to the evidence, right? Well, if you formed a belief in violation of that principle, it would not be justified, right? So whatever your principle is, whatever your rule is, you have to follow the rule when forming your belief, right? If you don't follow the rule, then it's not justified, right? And so Plantinga here is saying, look, I don't think anyone wants to say that religious people are all flouting reason. Like it would be quite uncharitable, right? To say that they are all violating basic rules of rationality and reason. I mean, a harsh agnostic or a harsh atheist might say that, but no friendly atheist would say that, right? Even very staunch atheists are going to acknowledge that people have what for them are very rational reasons, right, for believing in something. Okay, good. So again, it's possible to believe, right, that someone could meet the criteria Plantinga lays out in order to meet that. And again, to review that criteria, this is on slide 22, right? So the criteria you need to be a defensible exclusivist. There are three things. You must be rather fully aware of other religions. You must know that there is much that at least looks like genuine piety and devoutness in them. So you can't look at the other religions and just be like, ugh, they're all so lame, right? Like you have to acknowledge and be respectful of differences and that there is genuine, authentic, real devotion, right? And dedication within those traditions, right? You can't think like everyone's a phony except for members of my religion and my faith, right? You can't, that's arrogance that he's not defending, right? That's going to be over the top. Okay, so and then the third one is that you must believe that you know of no arguments that would necessarily convince all or most intelligent dissenters. So this is being aware of objections. Okay, so you can't be aware of objections that would convince most people to disagree with you, right? Like that's the basic, again, criteria of what we're looking for here. And so again, under a deontological account of justification, he thinks we can probably envision plenty of religious people who have studied other religions, right, who respect them and who know criticisms to their own faith and are still, right, they've met those three criteria. They still maintain their faith. They maintain the exclusivity that their faith is the one true faith. According to him, right, even under a deontological account, they would be considered justified. Okay, under a virtue epistemological account, right? This is a form of judging rationality, justification, knowledge, not based on the belief, but based on the person, right? So was the person engaging in intellectually virtuous activity when forming the belief, right? So were they only looking, right? So some of the famous cognitive vices that you might be aware of are things like confirmation bias, right? Where you only look up evidence that confirms your belief and not evidence against it, right? That would clearly be a violation of being rational or justified in virtue epistemology, right? A virtuous person should look at all available evidence, right, and assess it equally, and not only favor evidence that confirms their belief. But again, Plantinga is going to say that my third criteria addresses this, right? They already have to make sure that they're engaging in epistemic virtues, right? So justification, again, requires a duty to treat similar cases similarly, right? Even if we're talking about something like religion, we're still not violating any sort of virtuous behavior by saying that one is right and the other one is not. Again, as long as we meet those other criteria, right? We're not being disrespectful. We've done our due diligence and engaged in critical reflection. Okay, and again, here he says it's actually impossible. So this is maybe a critique of parallelism or pluralism. But the idea he says here is that it is actually impossible to view all opinions as being equally valid, right? Like he thinks it's sort of, you can't help but think that some opinions or options or beliefs are going to be better than others. Again, this is a claim he's making. He doesn't necessarily back it up. So I leave it to you to reflect on. Do you agree with this? Is there any way we can view all options on something as equal? Like, again, maybe if we're talking about something subjective, like I think, David, you mentioned before, like a favorite flavor ice cream, right? Like, yeah, low stakes. But again, if you have a favorite flavor and no one else agrees with you, you might judge the rest of the group a little bit. You might still think that your flavor is better. There might
Well,
still, then it's an authoritarian state. Then we're God. Right? Your will shall be what is. All right. So the next one is he's going to go through a couple other different accounts of rationality, right? Aristotelianism. Aristotle just thinks that humans have certain capacities for reason, right? So are you using your capacities for reason when forming your religious belief? Again, right? It seems like a respectful, charitable person would say, surely there are religious people who do, right? They're using their cognitive faculties correctly, right? They possess those powers and they exercise them. The next one is addressing it from a more a priori stance, right? Which we saw before. He definitely thinks there's some self-evident veracity to religious beliefs, right? That whole proper basicality stuff. So that he thinks it's fine. Deontology, again, for reason, right? And then this is the one, I'm sorry, it's such a terrible, it's not terrible, it's just in a different language. I am terrible because I can't pronounce it. Zweck rationalitat. That's what I got. Zweck rationalitat. All this means is it's referring to a way of means to end, right? So even if we think that the ends justify the means, right? Like maybe you just formed a belief to achieve a certain end, that's still okay. And again, he thinks that even if your religious belief was formed that way, at least under this account, an exclusivist could still count, right? So the idea here is that it's rational to do something that does not interfere with attaining certain epistemic goals, right? So like if your goal is to achieve knowledge and truth, right? And you form your religious beliefs in search of that, right? That's clearly part of the ends, right? A means to the end. So that's part of it. But if it's say you're trying to achieve something and forming your religious belief derails you from that, then it might be considered irrational under this account, right? Because it's no longer providing a means to the end. But most people acknowledge the functionality that religion plays in people's lives, right? It can very much hold an instrumental value, even if nothing else, right? You might hear a lot of atheists say things like, well, I'm a humanist first and an atheist second, meaning that like I'm willing to let people believe whatever helps them sleep at, whatever gets them through the day, whatever you need to, right? Wonderful. As long as it does the thing you need it to do. But if it's not serving you anymore, right? If it's no longer doing that thing, that's when the irrationality critique would come in here. So whatever the goal is, right? Plantinga thinks it's reasonable to think religious exclusivism would fit into that. And then of course he thinks under his account, our sensus divinitatis is functioning properly. Right? If you create belief. Look it up. So Zweck Rationalitat. Zweck rationalitat. Again, that's the trick. I apologize that he's using the technical terms, but again, it just got to be a German word. Someone look it up. I'm sure oh my gosh. The German language has so many words for complex emotions that we can't capture it with like many sentences. It's an amazing language. Definitely look up interesting German words. Like there's one word in the German language for the act of like people watching. And while you're watching them, you're like imagining their life. I can barely explain it with many words, and they have one word to explain that. Yeah, so definitely other languages are amazing. Okay, so that unfortunately does not leave us with a ton of time to talk about John Hick, but John Hick has a very interesting argument for religious pluralism. Now, what I want you to think about is because we've seen two types of pluralism this week, right? Radical and then regular religious pluralism. So I want you to think about which type of pluralism you think John Hick is arguing for. Are they all equally valid, or do you need to learn about all of them to get to the truth? Anyone get a sense already from maybe peeking at the PowerPoint, or if you had a chance to do the Hick reading yet? So it's not entirely clear from the readings. He doesn't like say it out loud. But it seems from his view that he's closer to a parallelist than an interpenetrationist. Okay, so what the reason that I say this is because he's going to be giving us an account of how all of those different paths, all of those different religions could potentially be describing the same ultimate reality, right? They could all be mapping onto the same truth, making them all potentially equally valid, right? And he's going to give us an empirical account for why we might think this is the case, right? Again, it might seem on the face of it like, how can we make panentheism and pantheism and monotheism, right? How could we possibly make these things go together? He's going to give us an account that relies heavily on really just the history of human evolution, right? And culture and language, and ability to communicate or lack thereof, right? To explain this. Right. So I think a great sort of encapsulation of this is on slide 18, right? There are encounters, right, of the divine, encounters with the divine, spiritual encounters, from different historical and cultural standpoints with the same infinite divine reality. And so to him, of course, he thinks this is going to lead to different types of awareness of that reality, right? So even if everybody had the same sort of experience, right, in all different parts of the world, they would be filtering that experience through their language, through their culture, through their experience, right, through whatever mechanisms they had. So if you have a religious experience of the divine in an eastern part of the world, you're going to interpret that experience differently than someone who has the same exact experience in a western part of the world, right? It's totally going to be informed by all the things I just mentioned, right? Our beliefs depend on language, right? We form propositions in our head based on words or images, right? But we tend to not be able to understand those images until we can put words to them, right? So language becomes really important here. What words are available to us to interpret the religious experiences one has had, let alone provide testimony to others, right? And then interpretation comes in. That's a whole nother, game of telephone, right? But the idea is that even that initial immediate interpretation of one's own phenomenological experience is going to be totally dictated by what moment in history you're alive in, where in the world you are, your socioeconomic status, right? Your background education, right? Your lived experience, all of those things, right? Are going to play into account. So of course, right, he says, we're going to end up with lots of different religious traditions. And so he uses a very famous parable, right? The parable of the blind men and the elephant, which I have an image of on page 19, right? This is a metaphor for this parallelism, right? How could it possibly be the case that people who use totally different words, concepts, images to describe a thing that exists could actually be describing the same thing, right? And so this is the parable he uses, right? Hopefully it's a pretty famous parable, right, that you're somewhat familiar with, right? But the idea is that it's 6 blind individuals, and so each of them are feeling a different part of the elephant. They form their belief about what the elephant is like based on their experience, right? But they're all having different experiences, right? Because they're experiencing different parts of the elephant, right? Something like this, though, a better analogy would be something like all the blind men feel the same part of the elephant, but they all have different words in their language for defining what that is, right? And so they all come up with different explanations for it based on that. But similar ideas, right? How can all of these seemingly disparate, potentially even contradictory ideas map onto the same ultimate reality, right? And maybe to make that make sense, you do have to really try to cognize infinity as best you can, right? Because infinity, like we saw, or no, sorry, we didn't see this totally in this class, but like we would see in Taoism, right? Infinity holds everything, right? So, and everything includes something's opposite. So yeah, something could both be one and many if we're truly talking about an infinite reality. All right, so lots of different views here, lots of different arguments for how one might take an attitude towards other views, but lots of food for thought. And this is important because, as we know, a lot of religious traditions, especially when it comes to affecting people's lived everyday life, right, comes through their moral doctrines. And so this is leading us into next week, right, which is why we needed to sort of start to think about our views on religious diversity before we talk about this, right? Is there only one set of moral rules to follow? Right? Who do we get those rules from? Are those rules up for debate? We will have to see about the relationship between God and morality. And so we're going to be looking at that next week. Okay. Yeah, so I'll leave that there. We have about 1 minute left of class, but I hope you guys have a wonderful weekend, and I will see you next Tuesday.